Hey friends, Katie here from Shangri. Since you're not able to come to us, I wanted to come to you. Today we're going to be talking about one of the world's greatest pollinators, the honeybee. But before we get started on our adventure, I need to change. Okay, I'm ready. I've got all my gear to open up those hives and show you what's inside. I'll see you there. All right, friends, here we are at the bee boxes. Now, these bee boxes are actually cared for by the beekeepers who take care of Shangri-La's bees, Muldrow Bee Farm. So if you've ever been out to Shangri-La and seen our bees in our observation hive, this is who helps us take care of them. All right, so you can see I've got on full safety gear. So just a reminder, you don't ever want to play with bees unless you know what you're doing and you have on the proper equipment. All right, so follow me. I'm going to show you what's going on inside this hive. Bees are insects. And an insect, if you remember, has an exoskeleton or a hard shell covering the outside of its body. 3 main body parts: its head, its thorax, and its abdomen. A pair of antennae on top of their head, and 6 legs. There are 3 different castes or types of bees within the beehive, and each one has its own characteristics, its roles, and its own responsibility. So the first bee that we're going to talk about is Her Majesty the Queen Bee. She's the heart and soul of the colony. She's the reason for nearly everything that the rest of the colony does. She is the only bee the rest of the hive cannot survive without her. And so only one queen lives in a given hive. She is the largest bee in the colony, and she's actually the only female bee that's able to reproduce. The queen has 2 primary purposes, and that's to produce chemical scents that help regulate the unity of the colony, and also to lay eggs. Now, if the queen bee dies, the workers will create a new queen by selecting a young larva, the newly hatched babies, the egg, larva, pupa, adult. Bees go through complete metamorphosis. And so it chooses a young larva and begins feeding it royal jelly, and that enables the larva to develop into a fertile queen. So the next bee we're going to talk about is the worker bee. And the majority of the hive's population consists of these worker bees. And like the queen, worker bees are all female. Workers are smaller than the queen though, their abdomens are shorter, and on their hind legs they have a special adaptation called pollen baskets. And pollen baskets are used to tote pollen back and forth after they've been visiting flowers. And like the queen, the worker bee has a stinger, but her stinger actually has barbs on the end, and so it will cause the stinger to get stuck into your skin. Now, drone bees are the only male bee in the colony. Drones make up a pretty small percent of the hive's total population. The drone has huge eyes, and the eyes almost look like they cover his whole head. So that's an easy way to tell between the worker bee and the drone bee. Now, the drone bee doesn't forage for food from the flowers. He doesn't have those pollen baskets like the worker bees. He doesn't help building the comb in the hive because he has no wax producing glands. And in fact, he doesn't actually even help defend the hive because drone bees, male bees, do not have stingers. All right, so now let's talk about my favorite thing, honey. And honey is the sweet and syrupy substance that's produced by the bees from nectar of flowers. And honey is made up of about 20% water, as well as glucose and fructose and pollen wax and other mineral salts. And the composition, the consistency of the honey are actually dependent on the type of flower in which the bee gets the nectar from. And so if you've ever gone to the grocery store and seen all the different types of honey for sale, and they all might say something different like clover honey or buckwheat honey, you'll see that they all have a different color, and the different color means a different taste. So an average bee colony can produce anywhere from 40 to 100 pounds of honey every year. And there's a lot of factors that actually determine this, like nectar flow and pollen amount, but on average, that's usually what they can produce. The nectar that the bees go to gather is that sweet juice that's produced from the glands of flowers. And the bees extract extract the nectar from the flower by following those lines on the flower petals, just like we discussed in our flowers video, if you guys watched that one. Just like a landing strip, the bees know where to go. So the bee sucks that nectar from the flower with the help of its tongue or its proboscis, and it stores it in its abdomen or in its pollen sac. And it has a very unique process that occurs when the nectar is stored inside the bee. The water is actually drawn out in the intestines of the bee, and the bee produces special enzymes that actually make the nectar sweeter. And so not only do the bees possess the ability to acquire the nectar from flowers and turn it into honey, but they also play a vital role in the pollination of flowers. Honeybees pollinate 30% of all the food that Americans consume. They pollinate 85% of all flowering plants. So when the bee lands on the flower to collect that nectar, that's what it's after. Those pollen grains get stuck to their hairy legs. And as the bee flies from flower to flower, the pollen also goes from flower to flower. So then, as the bee is looking for that nectar, she's spreading that pollen around. So when the bee is done collecting her nectar, she goes back to the hive and she puts it into empty honeycomb cells. And the other worker bees then ingest that nectar out of those honeycomb cells and add more enzymes to it and dry it out even more. And make it into honey. And so when they're finally done, they'll put it back in the honeycomb one last time and then seal it off. And that's how you have those honeycomb covered combs in your hive. I'll see you guys later. You've had the opportunity to look inside the hive and see what goes on in one of these beehives, and hopefully you learned something from some of the knowledge that I shared with you. Challenge time. What I'd like you to do is think about which type of bee you would be. Would you be a queen bee, a worker bee, or a drone bee? Decide which bee you're going to be, and then write a story, a day in the life of what you're doing. How many flowers do you visit? Do you pick up pollen? How much nectar do you drink? Write it all down and let us know what you would do if you were a bee. All right, we miss you. We're proud of you. Stay curious.